If you ever plan to shoot video or take pictures outside, you'll need this at some point. This is an ND filter and it screws onto the front of your lens just like this. And what it does is reduce the amount of light that goes into your lens. This particular one is a variable ND filter or variable neutral density filter. And if you look at it, as you turn the front element of the filter, it gets lighter, and as you turn the other way, it gets darker, reducing the amount of light that goes into your lens. Now, why would you want to do this? Here are 3 ways in which you use an ND filter. The first and most obvious use of the ND filter is to reduce the amount of light that goes into your lens. In other words, this is like an exposure control method. The other day I was out on the balcony and I looked up at the sky, and it was a really nice day, very bright sunny day, but with a lot of clouds moving across the sky. And I thought this is a very good opportunity for me to take some time-lapse video of these really nice clouds passing across a very blue sky, sunny conditions. So I set my camera and I set it to the smallest aperture I could, which was f/22. I set my ISO to the lowest it could go, which is 200 on this camera. And for video, I set my shutter angle at 180. Now, if you don't know what shutter angle is, it is just a way for the camera to observe what we call the 180-degree shutter speed rule of filming. And that states that your shutter speed has to be double your frame rate for you to get the most natural motion blur. So I've set everything the way I should, and I look at the exposure, it is still way too bright. The details in the clouds were getting lost, and the blue sky was looking all washed out. And I'd run out of options in terms of bringing down the exposure, as you can see. And so the only thing I could do is slap on my neutral density filter and use that as my exposure control. And then I just cranked it up until I got the exposure that I wanted. And in the end, I got good details in the clouds. And for those clouds, I got a really nice deep blue sky as the background as they moved across the sky. If I was going to take just a picture of the clouds, I have more flexibility, because as long as I'm not using a flash, I can crank up my shutter speed until I get the right exposure. The second use of the neutral density filter is to enable you to shoot with your aperture wide open, even in very bright conditions. The reason you'd want to shoot wide open is so that you can get that really nice background blur, or bokeh as we call it in photography. Now, for you to get that bokeh in very bright conditions is almost impossible, because when you open up your iris, you obviously have higher exposure and your image will be overexposed. So how do you control that exposure? If you're just taking a picture, you could just crank up your shutter speed until you get your right exposure. But sometimes you're not able to crank up your shutter speed in photography if you are using a flash, for example. And that is because a flash unit has what we call a maximum flash sync speed. When you exceed about 200 to 250 in terms of shutter speed and you're using a flash, you end up with a banding on your photograph, because the flash is no longer syncing with the shutter speed, and so you get these dark bands that form on your image. And so in that case, you're limited to about 1/200 to 250 in terms of shutter speed. So in those bright conditions, you won't be able to take a really nice picture that is well exposed. And so to bring down or to control your exposure, you turn to the ND filter, and you adjust your ND filter so that you get the right exposure when you're using your flash. The only other way you could get the right exposure is to go into what is called high speed sync, and that's where you're able to exceed that maximum flash sync speed. That is actually assuming that your flash is capable of high speed sync, and you know how to do that. Simplest way around that is to use your neutral density filter, bring your exposure down, keep your aperture wide open, and you get that nice blurry background without overexposure. The final scenario where you would need your ND filter is where you are shooting at very slow shutter speeds. In both still photography and videography, slow shutter speeds result in a lot more motion blur. And so you'd use those slow shutter speeds where you want to see that motion blur of vehicles passing or light trails, or you're shooting a waterfall or water flowing and you want that water to look very smooth. Now when you're using those slow shutter speeds, it means more light is getting into your lens. That means your exposure is going up. And so if you're shooting during the day, you need another way of controlling your exposure so that you don't overexpose your image at those slow shutter speeds. When you're buying your ND filter, make sure you buy the one that fits your lens. When you look at your lens, you see your filter thread diameter. For this one is 62. Make sure you buy the same ND filter diameter so that the two fit. The other thing you need to be careful with ND filters is they are not supposed to affect your image, but the cheaper ones will affect your image. And so sometimes you get vignetting on your image, or you can get some artifacts on your image. And so if you're going to invest in ND filters, make sure you buy the best that you can afford, because the cheaper ones will definitely affect your image. The other thing you need to know about ND filters is that this one is a variable. It will have a range for how much it blocks out the light in one filter. But you can also get individual filters, and so you can end up with a set of filters. The variable ND filters are more versatile and you don't need to carry a whole bunch on a shoot, so I would recommend those ones. Vital piece of equipment that you need in your camera bag. And that's it. 3 ways of using an ND filter. This accessory is a must for any photographer or videographer, especially if you plan to shoot outside in bright sunny conditions, or you want to control your exposure for other reasons. See you next time on Tech Booth.